Times Square, smack dab in the middle of Midtown, is an oasis of celebration and a sewer of crime. Welcome to the 11th hour. I'm Robert Lipsyte. Times Square is the heart of the city, and many people feel it's a diseased heart, weakened by crime. On 42nd Street, between 7th and 8th Avenues last year, there were more than 2,000 reported crimes. That's more than 6 a day. At least one was violent: a rape, a robbery, an assault, a murder. If the city has its way, this is what a new Times Square will look like. 4 massive towers looming over the southern end of the square, and in their shadow, replacing a string of cheap movie houses, a glittering boulevard of renovated theaters. Joining me now is an advocate of that new look, Carl Weisbrod, head of 42nd Street Development for the Urban Development Corporation, a state agency working with the city and private business. And Paul Siegel, who opposes the new look. Paul Siegel is an architect. He's past president of the New York chapter of the American Institute for Architects, but he's speaking only for himself on this show. Gentlemen, welcome. Carl, let me ask you specifically about 42nd Street. There is a sense among critics, and I even have it a little bit too, that you're killing the street to save it.
Well, we're not killing 42nd Street. 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenue has been not only as bad as your opening remarks indicated in the past year, but has been the worst block in New York City for almost half a century now.
The worst block in all of New York City, including the South Bronx and Brownsville and Brooklyn?
The single worst block in New York City in terms of reported crime. But reported crime, I think, doesn't give a full sense of the problems of this block. It is the center for runaways. It is the center for drug addiction and drug sales. 1,000 drug arrests were reported on this one block alone last year.
But Carl, that really sounds like a police problem, and you're talking about putting up 4 giant buildings to solve crime.
42nd Street has been a police problem, to be sure, and it continues to be a police problem. It is the most patrolled block in New York City. It receives a manning level of about 60 law enforcement officers a day, and just over this past weekend, Commissioner Ben Ward announced the assignment of an additional 100 police to the immediate 42nd Street area. Police have not been able to solve the problem of 42nd Street. So 160
cops can't do it, but a $2.5 billion development. Paul, does that make sense to you?
It does make sense that we ought to change that block. It doesn't make sense that that's the right way to do it. It doesn't to me for a couple of reasons. I think that what's special about New York is that it has different kinds of neighborhoods. It has a Park Avenue that's a corporate center, has residential neighborhoods, and it has an entertainment center. And I think that the strategy of preserving and enhancing the entertainment center by putting large corporate buildings in virtually the center of it is the wrong strategy. I think the buildings themselves are reasonably designed, in fact well designed, for the question that they were asked to solve. I think it's the wrong question.
The wrong question?
Well, they were asked to create great corporate headquarter buildings there.
And you wouldn't put it there. You would do what? Precisely, would you make it more of an entertainment, more porn, more sleaze, what?
Well, I don't think, you know, that's kind of a do you still beat your wife question a little bit.
Yeah, it is.
I don't think that to be a great entertainment center, and it's not only great Broadway theater, upscale entertainment, it's also great entertainment for everyone. It's a very popular movie center. A great percentage of the movie theater tickets sold in Manhattan are in the Times Square area. So it gets a full range of the kind of people that live in New York. I don't think that the way...
Well, that may be true of Times Square, but not of 42nd Street. I worked there in that area for 15 years, and when I was in college, of course, I went to bad Western movies there. So, I mean, it has always been a dangerous block, a block of cheap movies, of cheap food. It does have a very specific ambiance. And I'm wondering about changing it part of the way. You really feel it has to be changed entirely?
Well, I think there's a distinction, and Paul was getting at it a little bit, and I would just like to expand on it, between Times Square and what starts at the so-called crossroads of the world on 7th Avenue and 42nd Street, and then moves up Times Square to 47th Street, and 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenue. They're linked, to be sure, but they're two quite different cultures and quite different worlds. 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenue is simply the worst block in the city and has to be totally transformed.
But it's also the anchor for Times Square.
Well, it's not the anchor.
That culture moves in and out of 42nd Street.
It does. That culture moves in and out of 42nd Street, but the anchor on 42nd Street and 7th Avenue and Broadway, the crossroads, is the anchor and sort of the linchpin between 42nd, between 7th and 8th, which is awful and I believe has to be totally transformed, and which we are in the process of transforming from what is there now, which is a concentration of sex-related businesses, fast food restaurants, pinball arcades, hole-in-the-wall grocery stores that sell nothing but beer, condoms, and knives, basically.
Where are all
and
those
movie
stores
theaters.
and people going to go?
Well, I think that many of them will go out of business because they're marginal now, existing on this main thoroughfare, which is only between the 7th and 8th Avenue subway station. One of the reasons 42nd Street is so intractable is because of where it's located. There hasn't been any new development on this block, by the way, for 60 years. That's extraordinary for a Manhattan block. And a lot of these businesses will simply go out of business. The rest of them will try to relocate in the Times Square area because this is where their market is. But in isolation, these businesses are not the same kind of problem, the same kind of threat, do not create the same environment that they do now on 42nd Street in concentration. I think the issues of Times Square from 42nd Street up to 47th Street, the face of Times Square, present a different set of issues, and I think we all agree that we would like to see the historical ambiance of Times Square, the excitement, the meeting place notion, the entertainment center, which also will be created between 7th and 8th Avenue.
Well, that, of course, will be changed by these 4 towers and the thousands upon thousands of people that will be flooding the area in the daytime, and then, much like Wall Street, moving out again at night.
Well, the idea of a mixed-use neighborhood I don't think is a poor idea at all. I think that this is just being overdone. I think that the sense of balance will be lost. I think that what is proposed for that block, which is going to substantially change it, should be done. I don't think that you need to pay the price of this kind of overdevelopment at the crossroads site to achieve it.
Well, by the
price
power,
is pretty minimal.
Paul, by the power invested in me by the 11th hour,
Right.
I'm giving you the plans, and you can have the second draft on them. What would you do?
What would I do instead?
Right.
I would try to use those sites as development sites for uses related to that area. I think it's wrong to
Be specifically
be
uses.
specific. First of all, I wouldn't put so much density there. I think that the neighborhood already suffers from too many people, too much of the day. I think much lower density would be appropriate. Second of all, I wouldn't try to develop it as corporate offices for major law firms, for other uses that belong more appropriately on Park Avenue. I would try to develop it for uses that are more compatible with the entertainment industry, either businesses that are in the entertainment industry or in related industries, so that they won't try and need to make their buildings look very out of place in Times Square.
Well, as long as you keep the cheap movies that I can do, Paul, Carl, don't go away. When we come back, we'll be joined by Brendan Gill of The New Yorker, a fierce defender of the present Times Square. But first, there's an old Times Square saying, there's a broken heart for every light on Broadway. Well, I don't know much about the hearts, but we can show you something about the lights.
Times Square, I think, represents the playground of a city, of a great city. And I think it has always been a playground as long as it's been called Times Square.
Come on along and listen to the lullaby of Broadway, the hip hooray and ballyhoo, the lullaby of Broadway.
If you look through photographs of the history of Times Square, you see a lot of social history there, the kinds of things that were important to people. the kind of theater and movies and entertainment that they liked.
Times Square was a place of spectacle. Not only the spectacle that required that you buy tickets to sit in the second balcony or the orchestra, but spectacle just walking down the streets. And all around you, you would see these unbelievable displays of animation before there was a Walt Disney.
Artcraft Strauss has made all the major signs illuminating Times Square since the turn of the century. The neon salesmanship of the Star family, 3 generations so far, has become an art form.
Neon was invented in 1923 and it came to America in 1927. And people immediately saw the possibilities of this pure kind of light. Neon was originally used as an architectural element to decorate buildings and the ceilings of nightclubs. Because of its flowing form, it fit in well with the Art Deco sensibility. My grandfather, Jake, was one of the first people to see the application of neon to outdoor advertising.
Arthur Benline worked for Lowe's in the square's heyday, building its sumptuous movie palaces. When he needed another fabulous marquee for his theaters, he turned to Artcraft Strauss.
When I worked around here in the 1920s and 1930s, this was a class street. Ziegfeld did his big shows in the New Amsterdam, and he also had the New Amsterdam roof, which had the Ziegfeld Frolic.
Brother, can you spare a dime?
In the 1930 and 1940 era, many of the fine theaters that used to get $3 or $3.50 top, people wouldn't go for that anymore. They couldn't afford it. They wanted movies for 50 or 60 or 75 cents.
In those days, movies had a first run on Broadway, an exclusive first run. So it was worthwhile for the movie company to build a spectacular display just for the movie. So very famous movies like Joan of Arc and the Charlie Chaplin movies and the movie called Carnegie Hall, all of those had their own neon displays.
And when America beat the Japanese in World War II, there was only one place to celebrate. Marie Lampard came from Pennsylvania.
Everybody was singing and hugging each other and dancing and philosophizing about how the world was going to be so marvelous from that day forward. There was a very handsome sailor who was proposing to the beautiful girls around, and as he did this, he was explaining that he came from Boise, Idaho, and that he'd promised his parents to come home with a wife.
My very first job at Artcraft was the same year that I first learned how to type. I was a very small child, and it was election night. Eisenhower was running against Stevenson. And it was my job to stay in our office at the Palace Theater and receive the messages over the UPI wire and translate them into the ticker tape that operated the traveling message display. The crowd was out in the street, and although I couldn't see them, I could hear them. As the results came out on the traveling message sign, they would cheer or boo, depending on whom they were rooting for.
They say the neon lights are bright on Broadway. On Broadway.
In the 60s, the square fell on dark times. After pornography and crime came the energy crisis.
A lot of companies turned their lights off and have the signs taken down, and that added to the feeling of gloom and decay in the street.
As Times Square revealed New York in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, I think Times Square may very well reveal New York today.
Joining us now, Brendan Gill, author, writer of the New Yorker's Skyline Department, a founder of the Committee to Reclaim Times Square. Welcome. I have to tell you right off that I've always found 42nd Street in particular a venal Disneyland, although I kind of like Times Square. How would you change it? How would you reclaim it?
Disneyland, the venal Disneyland would be one, the opposite of what it really is now. Times Square is supposed to measurably honky-tonk. Nobody pretends that Times Square ought to be what the block of 42nd Street is between 7th and 8th Avenue. However, I think always from the beginning it's been disingenuous to suppose that the situation there, which is endemic throughout the entire world with crack, teenage male prostitution and all those things, is curable by architecture. And so I feel strongly that building a gigantic enterprise of this kind, this 13-acre monstrous thing of office buildings, is exactly wrong. And that no time in history has the venality that you speak of been corrected simply by architecture. So I would go along with what Paul Siegel has said, that there must be a reclaiming of Times Square in a good sense with appropriate activities that are related to all the activities that have always existed for 50 or 80 years in Times Square. Carl has tried to separate the 42nd Street thing from Times Square, but I agree with you that it is the base of the anchor, it is the anchor, it is the beginning of the whole thing, and it can be altered without being utterly transformed, and it isn't just a question of pornography.
You think that the crime problem can be solved without putting 4 towers in?
No, what I would rather say is that it can't be solved by architecture. It has to be, it is a sociological problem. It happens to exist not only here, but in Moscow and in Beijing and everywhere else on Earth at the present moment.
So you're not offering us a solution to 42nd Street?
There isn't a solution, and there was something worse than the absence of a solution, which is that the situation is going to stay, but is going to be dissipated into different directions. But the real likelihood is that it will move over into Clinton, which is now an attractive area of brownstones and restaurants and so on, and then everybody in that area will presumably be subject to the same threat of losing their...
Well, that's a good question, Carl. Why not just leave 42nd Street alone? You could put signs up at either end and say, go in here at your own risk.
Well, we've tried that in this country, and it's been unsuccessful. We tried it with the Boston Combat Zone, which was not nearly as depraved or difficult a street as 42nd Street. I would just disagree with Brendan to say that while drugs and prostitution and crime certainly do exist all over this world, I don't think there's a block in the world that I've ever been on that is anything approaching 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenue. First.
You haven't been in Naples, perhaps.
Second.
Or in Bangkok.
Second.
What about...
This is the gateway to New York City. This is one of the major entrances
Do you
to New York
feel
City.
that a parade of innocents goes through 42nd Street and are attacked without knowing that this is a block that one should stay away from?
Many times. Many times. And attacked in funny ways that don't even show up in the crime statistics. A tourist who is going to the bus terminal or down to the Circle Line on 42nd Street and the Hudson River will walk down the street and be verbally assaulted. That won't show as a crime statistic, and it isn't a crime. But it's a verbal assault that will make that person think twice before coming back to New York City, or especially if they're not prepared for it and don't have the defenses New Yorkers have. Second, just to give you a sense of how off-putting this block is to certain people, 86% of the people who walk on the street, and sometimes they're 9,000 an hour, are males. Only 16% are women. This is a block that is, in essence, off-limits to women. That's unacceptable, I think, in the city.
What I was going to say, that I would fear that anybody watching this program would think that we were very innocent people indeed if we suppose that we're all talking here about trying to help New York City selflessly, and that this is the method of selfless improvement of the greatest city on earth, which we now are. It is not that alone. It is the entire Times Square thing, and in particular the 42nd Street thing, is an attempt to make a tiny handful of very rich real estate developers still richer. A number of
Don't you think this
individuals...
is symptomatic of the entire city, Manhattan in particular?
Of course.
The great towers are being thrown up without referendum or
I think we've already lost the war for the theater district. The theater district has been given away to a tiny handful of real estate developers. The theater district is dead. Now we're fighting this little battle in the war on 42nd Street. But the intention is not simply to make this a greater city. It is an intention to make a certain number of people extremely rich indeed.
If you make buildings for some of these people, what do you think, Paul?
We don't work for those people, actually. We try to avoid those people. I think Brendan is correct. I don't think that the public is blameless, though. I think it's a perfect case of the city is being destroyed for the citizens. The light and air is being taken away. The infrastructure that's a 19th century infrastructure is being loaded with a 21st century density that it can't handle. It's becoming a very unpleasant place in many respects, and that unpleasantness will eventually, I fear, become a real hindrance to the city being economically successful, because it won't be a pleasant place to be. It's not a pleasant place to be. It won't be economically viable.
And the discussion of sleaze on 42nd Street of Slime Alley is irrelevant.
No, it's not irrelevant, not at all. I remember when I was in college, two of my roommates who'd never been here took a bus into New York, looked around Port Authority, came back and looked at me and said, "You're from there?" I don't think that that's it, but it shouldn't be posed as a "do you still beat your wife" question. I don't think it should be posed that it's either going to stay the way it is or have something else that is different but also bad.
Do you have a plan?
Well, let me just say one thing before I say whether I have a plan, and that is that one of the reasons we're all in effect in bad faith when we try to solve this problem and talk about it without dealing with the major things is this, that I don't even blame the developers. I don't mind this handful, all that much, this handful of people suddenly having $500 million or $800 million being given to them through tax rebates and other things.
Oh, I do. That's big of you, Brendan. I resent that because that's taxpayers. I'm not. I don't understand why all this money is going to developers.
Well, it shouldn't, but behind the developers, they are the puppets of the great insurance companies and the banks. These people are invented as puppets and can well afford to be invented as puppets by the banks and insurance companies who have no interest whatever in New York City for the benefit of the citizens of New York. The big insurance companies and the banks don't really give a damn about New York City. If there's more money to be made in Dallas, they go to Dallas. They go to Houston. They go wherever the money is.
I think Carl has to respond to this.
I would like to respond to both the economic issues here as well as what the new Times Square is going to be. First, with respect to the economic issues involving 42nd Street. This project was a competitively bid project. The developers who were selected were the developers who gave the best economic return to the city. It was really bid in order to first clean up the blight on 42nd Street. Second, an issue we really haven't talked about at all today, bring back the incredible potential of 42nd Street. This was once the best entertainment street.
Give us the history. I mean, this was some years ago, and tax abatements was part of the package.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And there is a tax abatement here. On the other hand, even during the tax abatement period, which will last for about 15 years, the city will receive, as an economic return from this project, 6 times more than it would have received in taxes if this project didn't exist. This area, this 13-acre area in Times Square right now, pays less in real estate taxes than a medium-sized office building. It is one of the most underdeveloped areas in New York City, and it's an area that drains municipal resources because of police, sanitation resources, and the like. It is an area that should be contributing to the city, both as a tourist attraction and as an economic generator.
How can you argue against an economic bonanza that will rehabilitate all the prostitutes and pawn shop owners?
The potential zoning, what could be put there, is so different than what is there now, that nobody would ever build up to here. They will always wait to build up to here, and while they're waiting, it will decay. It will become the kind of places that all transitional neighborhoods, as opposed to long-term neighborhoods, become.
This has been going on for 7 years. This has been going on for 7 years. Everything's been deteriorating for 7 years. But the
Street has existed as it has for 60 years, and it's time for the public to do something about it. It also, at one point, was the greatest entertainment street in New York City. This was the street where the Marx Brothers opened in Coconuts. This was the street where Fred and Adele stayed.
Carl, we're running out of time. Why hasn't anything happened yet? I mean, have there been delaying tactics?
There have been 44 lawsuits brought against the project, many of which Brendan has been a plaintiff on, although not currently.
All have
been dismissed. This is also, I think, worth pointing out, a project that has the support of the governor and the mayor, the approval of unanimously of every legislative body that has considered it. It has unanimously been successful in the courts. We have now filed our condemnation petition. We're ready to proceed. We expect to have the land shortly and start rehabilitating the theaters.
And they haven't got the project in hand yet. It still is not the whole project that they said they had 7 years ago. They still have nobody building on 8th Avenue across from the bus terminal, either on the east side, southeast side, or the northeast side.
Do you think the governor cares about New York?
No. And I think Mayor Koch, I think, cares about giving it away. So we've got two people that don't give a damn.
Mm-hmm. I really think that's
don't you think, though, Brendan, that ultimately it's easy to blame it on the politicians or the developers. I think ultimately the citizens, who are the ones who are losing the most, are the ones who haven't stood up.
Which citizens in particular, Paul?
Everybody. The 7 million people who live here.
Carl stood up.
But that leaves so we're about 6 million short.
No, but there
are a lot of people to whom this is going to, I believe, and I agree with Brendan, have a negative impact, and they haven't become educated on the topic, and they're not aware of what happens in this and other areas like it.
I hope they're more educated now. Paul Siegel, Carl Weisbrod, Brendan Gill, thank you so very much for being with us. This is the 11th Hour. I'm Robert Lipsyte. This is Robert Lipsyte. Join me next time on the 11th Hour when I get some free advice from Bernard Meltzer, Gary Null, and Dr. Ruth.